Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a huge pleasure to be presenting Professor Manfred Nowak this evening in this series of the Academy Lectures. As you know, he's going to speak on torture and other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment. I first met Manfred a long time ago in 1993 at the Vienna World Conference of Human Rights. And Manfred Nowak at that time had the thankless task of organizing all the non-governmental organizations of the world who had descended on Vienna and had been put in the sous-sol, in the basement of the Vienna Conference Center. And I think it's fair to say that that whole sous-sol became a kind of pressure cooker, with the NGOs getting more and more frustrated that nothing was happening above ground where the governments were meeting to finalize the Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action. And we had a share of dramas there at the time. There were walkouts, the NGOs protested, there were boycotts, and in the end, probably all of that added to a rather successful conference. But at the time, I think we both suffered hugely. It was very dramatic. Professor Nowak is Professor of International Law at Vienna University, and he is, as you know, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. He's a former Swiss Chair of Human Rights at the Graduate Institute and taught at the Graduate Institute and at the Academy last year. He has had multiple posts. I'm going to mention just a few that are pertinent. He's currently the co-director of the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Human Rights. From 2000 to 2007, he served as the chairperson of the European Masters Programme on Human Rights and Democratization, the EMA in Venice. From 1987 to 1989, he was director of the Netherlands Institute of Human Rights at the University of Utrecht. And within the United Nations, he has been, as I've said, since 2004 Special Rapporteur. He's been on the Austrian delegation to the UN Commission on Human Rights. In 1993, he was appointed as an expert member of the UN Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances, and later was appointed as the UN expert on legal issues, which in the convoluted language of the UN was called the drafting of a binding instrument on enforced disappearances, but as you all probably realize, is now the Convention on Enforced Disappearances. So he is in a way one of the founders of that. And he's advised the High Commissioner for Human Rights on poverty reduction strategies. He's a member of the International Commission of Jurists since 1995, and he has served as a judge on the Human Rights Chamber in the Bosnia-Herzegovina in Sarajevo. He's a board member of multiple NGOs. He's been awarded multiple prizes, and he's published more than 400 articles and books in the field of human rights, including, and I might actually just produce it. This tome, which is the Commentary on the Civil and Political Rights Covenant, second edition, and I have to say no good homes should be without one. It is really an essential piece of reading for anybody who wants to call themselves a human rights lawyer. So Manfred Nowak, an impressive curriculum vitae. He's also a great speaker and a personal friend. Manfred, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Endo, and it's always embarrassing to have this kind of introductions. I'm very happy to be here, to tell you a little bit about torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. I will promise, and this is really a promise, to have the theoretical parts very, very short and then really go, we discussed it before, more into my personal experiences as a human rights fact finder. I did some 16 missions, and then we had 3 joint studies, and I do now some general conclusions actually for a global study on torture and ill treatment that I presented to the Human Rights Council on Monday. Very quickly only, and I know that many of you here know as well what torture is, but we have a legal definition of torture in the United Nations Convention. It has, in principle, 4 main elements: causing of severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental. Severe, severe. It's not excruciating pain, as John Yo or Jay Bybee tried to argue in the torture memos from the US Justice Department, but it must be severe. There's a certain threshold. There must be a state responsibility, either directly by state actors or by their acquiescence, so you can also be complicit in torture or ill treatment. I also look into questions of domestic violence. I look into questions of traditional practices against, in particular, women and girls, like FGM, etc. But, of course, only if there is the state not living up to its due diligence obligation to prevent this kind of violence, torture, ill treatment by non-state actors. You cannot torture by negligence. Even if you forget a detainee and this person is slowly starving to death or whatever, it can never be torture, but it will be, of course, cruel and inhuman treatment. But it's not only the intention, it must be the deliberate infliction for a certain purpose. And that is what really makes the difference between torture and other forms of CIDT, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. And the purposes are enumerated in the Convention. 90% or more of the cases that I find in my fact-finding missions are similar than in the Middle Ages. Nothing really has changed. It is extracting of a confession. And why? Because the administration of justice is not functioning in the big majority of countries in the world. So in other words, of course, you have a rising level of crime. We have a lot of crime. And of course, politicians want to be tough on crime. They want to be seen to be tough on crime. And that means there's a lot of pressure by politicians, by the media, by the public in general, but particularly also by judges and prosecutors on law enforcement bodies, on the police, to solve cases. And very often the police in many countries of the world has no other idea of solving cases than extracting a confession. So if you arrest somebody, often for minor crimes, you're suspected of having committed a crime, you're arrested, and you are not cooperating, and then they put pressure on you, and if you're still not cooperating, then this pressure might soon amount to infliction of severe pain or suffering. And I'm not going into the methods of torture, but that's the main reason. Administration of justice is not functioning. If you have money, you can buy yourself out. There's a lot of corruption in the administration of justice, whether you bribe the police officer or you bribe the judge or you bribe the prosecutor. You are then released on bail or whatever. Bail is often used for corruption purposes. So those who end up in inhuman conditions of detention, being subjected to torture, are usually the most disadvantaged, discriminated, that means the poor. So to be in detention, often also pre-trial detention for many years, is a privilege of the poor. That's what I said about 90%. Others are, of course, in the fight against organized crime, fight against terrorism, of course. It's not primarily extracting confession, it's extracting information, intelligence information, future terrorist attacks, members of Al-Qaeda, whatever. So that is, but again, in quantitative terms, this high-level kind of persons who are tortured, the political prisoners, whoever, is in fact a small minority, although often we think the main torture victims are political prisoners. No, the main, in quantitative terms, are the normal poor in many countries. Sorry. Intimidation, discrimination, for instance, rape in custody is always torture because it is gender-based discrimination, even if it's not used for extraction of any kind of confession or information. And I add powerlessness. And that is what, in my opinion, is the distinguishing criteria. So that is what makes torture such a bad thing, such one of the worst human rights violations. It's a direct attack on human dignity because It is inflicted on a person who is powerless, defenseless. You are stripped naked, you are hooded, you are handcuffed and shackled, or you are suspended, and then they tell you, we can do with you whatever we want. Better to cooperate. So it's this situation. If the police uses force in order to stop violence in a demonstration or quelling a riot, or then of course it's legitimate to use force because you are not dealing with powerless people. But as soon as you arrest somebody, the person is handcuffed and shackled or brought to the police station, then you're not anymore allowed to use force. Of course, we have many examples. Unfortunately, many of the methods of torture today were invented already in the Inquisition in the Middle Ages. Whether it's they just call different. Strapado is now called Palestinian hanging or Egyptian hanging or whatever, but it was the same method, or falanga or falaka, beating you on the soles of the feet. Waterboarding was already in the Holy Inquisition as a method of torture. Now, very, very quickly, torture and other forms of CIDD is absolutely prohibited. It was a reaction to, in particular, also the widespread practice of torture by the Nazis, by also Stalinism and others. Everywhere in the Universal Declaration, in the European Convention, and in other treaties, of course also Article 7 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, absolute prohibition of torture and other forms of ill treatment, but it doesn't mean that torture stopped. The French did, for instance, in Algeria, but most prominently in the 70s, late 60s, Brazil, Guatemala, and then 70s, most of the national security military dictatorships in Latin America used systematic practice of torture, and that was the main reason for NGOs, and most prominently Amnesty International, starting a global campaign against torture. The first global report was published in 1973, at that time saying in more than 60 countries of the world there is systematic practice of torture. Unfortunately, the situation is certainly better in Latin America, but globally speaking, we have more than 60 countries where torture is at least widespread. I'm not going very much now into detail. The point that I want to make is there's a difference between an absolute right and a non-derogable right. The prohibition of torture and slavery are the two examples that are both absolute and non-derogable. In other words, there is no balancing, in particular also not in exceptional circumstances. You can't balance torture against the right to life, for instance. So the classical ticking bomb scenario, if we find the person who has the key to the ticking bomb and we can save 200 lives, you still are not allowed to torture. It's an absolute prohibition for good reasons, because as soon as you start to say in exceptional circumstances, Latin America again is a good example. For the worst persons, we start to torture, you open up Pandora's box and it becomes a systematic practice. But even in times of war, in exceptional circumstances, where you can derogate from most human rights, you can derogate from the right to personal liberty, for instance, from the right to freedom of expression, etc. Derogation means you can suspend it for a certain time, Article 4 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but some rights are non-derogable. Most prominently, again, the prohibition of slavery, the prohibition of torture, and retroactivity of penal laws. As I said, there is a difference also between torture and CIDD. I'm not going into that now more, but the point that I want to say, of course, law enforcement officials have the monopoly of using force. As I said before, if you arrest a person and he doesn't want to be arrested, of course you can use force. You might even inflict severe pain or suffering. But this is not a powerless person. If he or she is attacking a police officer, of course you can defend yourself by using force. But as soon as, and that's why the powerlessness is so important. As soon as the person is powerless, you are not anymore allowed to use force. It's always the reaction as why did international law develop? It is always in reaction to major instances of having used torture. In the Middle Ages, it was legal, in Europe at least. Charles V's, his criminal procedure code, about 2/3 was about torture. What kind of torture methods you could use in relation to which kind of criminal suspects, etc. It was under Enlightenment abolished, but it was abolished from the law. That doesn't mean that it really ceased to exist. In reaction to National Socialism, it was the main reason for the international protection of human rights, and again, the absolute prohibition of torture. I think Chile became the most important, the most well-known case. In reaction to that, we had the Convention Against Torture. As I said before, in reaction again to Amnesty's and others' global campaign. And also what happened in the former Yugoslavia, in particular Bosnia-Herzegovina, led to the first International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and then later to the ICC, where also the systematic and widespread torture against civilian population constitutes a crime against humanity. Now, very quickly, what are the major aspects of the Convention Against Torture? 3. One is combating impunity. Impunity still is one of the major reasons for the widespread practice of torture around the world. It was already in the Declaration, 75. Very quickly, the UN responded to Amnesty and others. And then the Convention Against Torture was drafted. And this is interesting, for the first time, really, in a classical human rights treaty, the criminalization of a certain conduct was made a state obligation. We have had that in many other treaties, fighting terrorism, for instance, hijacking, etc. Human rights treaty. If you are a state party, we have 146 states parties, you have an obligation to criminalize torture, but with appropriate sanctions. And unfortunately, I should tell you that the big majority of the states parties to the Convention Against Torture are violating this very simple obligation. They have not criminalized torture as defined in the Convention Against Torture. But only criminalizing is not enough. You also have a very broad jurisdiction. The usual criminal jurisdiction is territorial. If somebody is committing torture in Switzerland, then Switzerland has to bring this person to justice. But we also have the personality or nationality principle. If a Swiss citizen is torturing anywhere in the world, the Swiss government has an obligation to bring this person to justice by whatever means. You might also accept the passive nationality principle. If a Swiss person has been tortured in any other country, that might also establish your jurisdiction, but most importantly, universal jurisdiction. If the Pinochet case became most famous on this, if a Chilean citizen is torturing Chileans in Chile, wherever this person comes, if he comes to Switzerland as a state party to the Convention Against Torture, Switzerland has an obligation, not just a right, it's an obligation under Article 5.2 to first investigate, do we have enough evidence, preliminary investigation, to arrest the person, to make sure that the person is not fleeing, and then the principle aut dedere aut judicare means you can either extradite, and if you can't extradite, you have to exercise jurisdiction, you have to prosecute the person, bring the person to justice. Whether you can extradite or not depends on whether you have a request for extradition. And then secondly, there are certain limitations. If only the government of the state where the person has tortured is asking the extradition, and there's no chance that this government would bring him or her to justice, then you shouldn't. And we have the Habre case and others where the Committee Against Torture decided that Senegal, in this case, violated its obligation to criminalize first, but also then to bring Mr. Habre to justice. And as I said before already, the systematic or widespread practice is a crime against humanity. Fighting impunity is the main purpose of the Convention Against Torture. Of course, also prevention of torture, various ways and means, non-refoulement. You should not send somebody to another country where there's a serious risk of being subjected to torture. You should train your law enforcement. The non-applicability of information extracted by torture before courts, very, very important. As I said before, in countries where courts respect this principle, you can put a lot of pressure on the police, but it doesn't make sense. Even if they extract the confession, if you can't use it later before the courts, it's a major preventive measure. Finally, and I am a strong advocate in my work, I do whatever I can to convince states to ratify the optional protocol to the Torture Convention, and if they have ratified, to establish an independent national preventive mechanism. The idea came from Jean-Jacques Gaultier, since I am in Geneva. He was a very well-known person in Geneva, a banker, but a philanthrope, and he actually created the Swiss Committee Against Torture, which later became the famous APT, the Association pour la Prévention de la Torture, which is still today the most important international non-governmental organization fighting for this very system. And it's based on the ICRC. It's based on the idea if you can have access, if an independent body has access to places of detention, then this has a preventive and deterrent effect. That was the basic idea. Costa Rica took it up in 1980, but at that time the Commission on Human Rights was more occupied by drafting the Convention Against Torture. Then it was adopted in 1984, and then they said, now we have the Convention, it first needs to enter into force. So that's why we, I say we because I was to some extent involved in that, moved into the Council of Europe, and they adopted the European Convention for the Prevention of Torture, and the CPT, the committee, actually became a success story. So we have in Europe the system in all member states of the Council of Europe that an independent European committee can actually visit, carry out preventive and unannounced visits in all countries. So you don't need the invitation by the government. You can just say, we are coming in 2 weeks or in 1 month, and then there they can visit every police custody, remand center, prison, psychiatric institution, wherever somebody is deprived of liberty. And it does have a preventive effect on torture, but of course the standards of the CPT are also very important in improving prison conditions. And then later the UN took it up, and that is OPCAT. And I should say, although it was a compromise between the North and the South, in fact it's better than the European Convention, because it does not only create the subcommittee on the prevention of torture, a subcommittee of the Committee Against Torture, which has similar powers than the CPT, but in addition there is an obligation of every state party to create a national preventive mechanism, an independent commission, pluralistic, similar to a national human rights institution, to visit on a regular basis every place of detention. We still don't have a best practice, because many of the institutions that are now established are not well resourced, not independent enough, but we are working on it, and as I said, the APT is very, very important in that. Switzerland has recently ratified it, Germany has ratified it, Austria not yet, but a growing number of states are ratifying. Fighting impunity, prevention, and the third is the right of victims to adequate redress and reparation, a remedy and reparation. It's very important that victims of torture or alleged victims of torture have a right to complain to an independent body, and it should be quickly and independently, impartially examined whether they are tortured or not, and then it depends. If you find out that the person has been tortured, then you should bring the perpetrators to justice, but as important is that the victims have a right to adequate reparation. Again, in practice, it doesn't exist, more or less. It's very seldom that victims of torture are getting from the state that is responsible for torturing them adequate reparation, which for most victims is not money, it means rehabilitation. Victims of torture are traumatized and they need long-term psychological, medical, and social and other forms of rehabilitation. If they receive it, They receive it because they're fleeing their country, they're coming to a country of asylum, they are happy, they are granted asylum, and then it's usually private institutions, that the private torture rehabilitation centers that are providing this. But they are paid out of private donations. The European Union is paying, the United States, the UN Fund for Victims of Torture. It would be much better if states that are torturing, that are found to torture, should actually be obliged to pay most of the money into the UN fund, voluntary fund for victims of torture, or to create a system of universal civil jurisdiction. I think it would be very important, and unfortunately the House of Lords has recently done a wrong decision, in my opinion, by saying that not only states are immune before civil courts, but also their agents, including the Minister of Interior, even the police agents, in this case in Saudi Arabia, are immune from being not prosecuted, but from civil litigation before British courts. The British Parliament is working on a law that might be similar to the Alien Tort Claims Act in the United States of America. And of course, international monitoring was strengthened. We have the UN Committee Against Torture with the usual procedures, including the inquiry procedure, ex officio inquiry. We have the Special Rapporteur on Torture. It was all created about the same time. And, as I said before, the UN Subcommittee for the Preventive Visits to All Places of Detention. Now, coming to the Special Rapporteur, we are called Special Procedures. They were developed in the late 60s, early 70s. First on a country-specific basis, when the former Commission on Human Rights stopped its no power to take action doctrine and said, for instance, the first one was South Africa, 1967, there should be an independent group of experts, 5 members, a working group, to investigate the overall human rights situation in South Africa. It was the first one, later Israel, but then in particular Chile, 1975. And then we had many special rapporteurs in relation to the overall human rights situation in quite a high number of countries, in Asia, Africa, Latin America, in Europe, for instance, ex-Yugoslavia, Poland for a short period of time, Romania, etc. These are a little bit a species that is slowly extinguishing. The newly created Human Rights Council doesn't like those country-specific rapporteurs anymore. We have just a few left on Palestine, on North Korea, Myanmar, Sudan, but not anymore many. But we have more and more thematic mechanisms. The first one was the Working Group on Enforced Disappearances in 1980. Again, 5 members, because we have 5 regional groups. And as you said, I was serving as the Western member for 8 years on the working group, looking into individual cases. That's the one thing that we are doing, but also carrying out fact-finding missions, etc., in finding persons who disappeared. Again, originally a Latin American phenomenon, but very much today a global phenomenon. Second one was arbitrary and summary executions. Today it's Philip Alston, the Special Rapporteur. And the third one was created in 1985, the Special Rapporteur on Torture. And Peter Kroijmans from the Netherlands was the first one, Sir Nigel Rodley the second, Theo van Boven the third, and I'm the fourth one. Unfortunately, kind of all men from Europe, so the fifth one should ideally be a woman not from Europe, so from the South. If you have good ideas, come up, because soon my mandate will expire, and we are urgently looking for a person to carry out this function. Now, what are we doing? We are serving in our individual capacity. That means we are independent from governments, from non-governmental organizations, even from the Office of the High Commissioner. It's not always really true. We are to some extent dependent on the High Commissioner, but we try to be independent. Of course, the Human Rights Council tries to undermine our independence. We have now a code of conduct, and we are all the time accused of violating the code of conduct, but we are still trying to keep our independence, but we are heavily censored, I should actually say. The situation is much worse now in the Human Rights Council than it has been in the former Commission on human rights. Independence, of course, also means that we are non-paid, as all experts of the United Nations, also treaty body members, etc. But that strengthens also our independence in the sense that nobody should take these functions because of money. What are we doing? I'm sending on a daily basis urgent appeals or other communications to governments. It means we receive complaints by victims, family members, non-governmental organizations on the ground, human rights defenders, the OMCD, the Amnesty and others are providing us with complaints. What we do, and with we I mean, of course, in particular the staff working at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights here in Geneva. I am privileged also to have a highly dedicated staff at the Boltzmann Institute of Human Rights in Vienna, paid by certain governments. Otherwise it would just not be possible to be an active special rapporteur. And urgent appeals until recently were sent directly to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So really it could have been the same day. Somebody says a person has been arrested, put into a certain place which is notorious for torture. The local human rights defenders immediately inform the World Organization Against Torture, and they immediately send this to the Office of the High Commissioner. It might be in the same day or the day after that we look into, is it a credible source of information? Is the allegation consistent? If so, we send it to the government. And of course I'm saying, I don't know whether it's true. I'm sitting in Vienna, the office is in Geneva, we don't know whether it's true. But it is credible. But you have an obligation under the Convention Against Torture, under general international law, to immediately investigate, look into whether it's true or not, and report back to what you have found. If you find that the person has been tortured, then you should immediately stop torture, perhaps release the person, whatever, provide a remedy to the victim, bring the perpetrators to justice and report back. If you find out it's a wrong allegation, then also it's not enough that you just deny it, but you should tell us why you come to the conclusion that it's a wrong allegation. In the reality, depends on the government. I would say the big majority would acknowledge having received an urgent appeal and says thank you very much, and we are taking it very seriously, we are really investigating, and then you never hear anything anymore. That is unfortunately reality. But there are governments that take it seriously, that report back, that do investigate, and more often than I think actually, when I come on a fact-finding mission, I hear from detainees or others that a certain urgent appeal or other communication has actually made a difference. The person was released, etc., even if the government didn't respond at all, but it had an effect. It is different whether Amnesty or any other NGO is sending an urgent appeal or it comes from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations. Of course, we are reporting to the Council. I was still appointed by the Commission, but we were taken over reluctantly, but finally, after having been scrutinized and whatever, we have been taken over by the Human Rights Council. But I also am requested by the General Assembly to report. So I present the report, I did it last Monday, this Monday, to the Council, and in end of October to the General Assembly in New York. As I said, I promote OPCAT and other preventive mechanisms, and I carry out fact-finding missions. We are appointed for 3 years with a maximum of 1 renewal, so there's no way longer than 6 years, so my mandate will end towards the end of this year. And I think it's a good rule. I think others should carry on, and I think if one is too long busy with exactly the same, you are getting also it's difficult, let's put it that way, and it's very, very time-consuming. I can only visit a country if I'm invited by the government. That's the difference to OPCAT or the European Convention for the Prevention of Torture. But the government that invites me should respect my terms of reference. And that means I should have full freedom in the country, freedom of movement, but also freedom of inquiry. And for me, since torture takes place behind closed doors, it is more important than for other special rapporteurs to have the full right of access to all places of detention, and most of my time on fact-finding missions I do spend in police lockups, pre-trial detention centers, in prisons, in psychiatric institutions, in special institutions for minors and children. I'm quite often in terrible places where children are held, for illegal migrants, etc. Wherever somebody is deprived of liberty, I have the right to visit it and speak in private, and that is as important, even more important, in private, and that means without the presence of any government officials, with the detainee. Again, governments try whatever they can to undermine this. If I don't have a clear assurance, I'm not accepting the invitation. And I had to do that, for instance, in relation to the Russian Federation, when everything has been planned. And a few days before they found out that they have a legal system that would prevent me from speaking in private to detainees, I said, I thought you are a state party to the European Convention for the Prevention of Torture. What's with the CPT? CPT is different. CPT, there we have changed our laws, but we can't change our laws for you. So it was postponed in October 2006, although, as I said, everything was prepared, meetings with the ministers in Moscow, with Mr. Kadyrov in Chechnya, etc. At the last moment, we had to postpone it, and it is postponed forever. Also, this Monday, the Russian Federation again says, of course, Mr. Nowak is invited, but he has to comply, unfortunately, with our laws. But also the United States of America finally invited us for the joint study on Guantanamo, to come to Guantanamo Bay, but when we said that we also, of course, wanted to speak to some of the detainees, said, no, that's not possible. But we show you around, we show you how Guantanamo looks like, so we had to finally say no. And that is also in respect to other countries. Of course, I should have unsupervised contacts with NGOs, with lawyers, with victims, etc. That's a short overview of the visits that I have undertaken. I try to do 3-4 visits, missions per year. As I said, this in dark red were planned, and with planning I mean there's a lot of resources have invested. I mean, to planning a mission means months of work by the staff in Geneva, by the staff in Vienna, to analyze the legal framework, to do all the logistical preparations. That's why it is so frustrating if you are told 5 days before that you are not anymore welcome. And the most frustrating experience was Zimbabwe, which invited me, and where my 4 members of my staff were already in Johannesburg, talking there to NGOs, because there are quite many persons who have fled Zimbabwe in South Africa, and I was en route. I was already traveling when the government of Mr. Mugabe decided that it was not a good idea to invite me. So I stopped in Johannesburg. I tried to do whatever I could, and of course I had contact directly with Harare. Prime Minister Tsvangirai said, no, of course I want to see you, and I confirm my meeting with you on Thursday. This was a Tuesday, and I got even a fax that clearly said, I want to meet you, and somebody from the Foreign Office will, as usually, protocol officer, take you when you are coming to Harare Airport. I flew to Harare, and instead of the protocol officer, I got some security personnel of President Mugabe who kept me somewhere in the airport and then sent me back the next morning to Johannesburg. Although I was in constant contact with the Prime Minister, he even sent his direct secretary to pick me up at the airport, but the airport was closed, and even he was not allowed to enter the airport. They told him I had left already. The Minister of Interior said I have given clearance, but President Mugabe's order was more powerful. Yeah, the green ones is the ones that Greece is not yet 100% confirmed, but I hope it will take place in April. Papua New Guinea will take place in May. I was there last November and discussed it already, and everything is prepared. Cuba might take place in summer or early autumn, and the others took place. In 2 cases I found systematic practice of torture, and I'm very careful to use this term. This is the strongest accusation that you can say, that the government is systematically practicing torture, similar to Article 20 of the Convention, when the CAT committee carries out an inquiry procedure. In my case it was Nepal, but I should say this was in September 2005, when the conflict between the king on the one hand and the Maoists on the other hand, but also the democratic parties were all prohibited at that time. Parliament was dissolved. It was really at its height. And there was systematic practice of torture by the military, by the police, but also by the Maoists. The situation improved very much in the meantime. And Equatorial Guinea, which was later, which was probably the worst country that I have visited, not only systematic practice of torture, but also the most appalling prison and in particular police detention facilities that I have ever seen. It's something that you almost can't imagine, that people are spending in these conditions many, not just hours and days, but many weeks, months, or even years. Just finally, a few short photos, and those are definitely not the worst, but just to see overcrowding is a major problem. Here I'm in Sri Lanka. That's on the left hand is Bogambara prison in Kandy. Usually, sometimes you have 3 times the capacity, and that means that not everybody has a bed or a mattress. Right in front, right down, is a pre-trial detention facility in Colombo. And on the top right, you have one of the most notorious places of the Terrorism Investigation Department against LTTE suspects, and many persons of Tamil origin were soon at that time considered to be Tamil supporters or members or LTTE supporters. And there I found the most serious forms of torture. That's one of the worst places I have seen. It's the so-called torture room in the headquarters of the Criminal Investigation Department in Lagos, Nigeria. It was very, very difficult to enter this room, but I had a government, and that I should say that's very important, that cooperated, because the police chief of Lagos said no way that you can enter there, and I had to call the Inspector General of the police in Abuja and tell him, you promised, and that's what I usually do. I have a 24 hours line with the competent minister or Inspector General, and he gave the order in my presence to the police chief of Lagos so that we finally could enter this room, about 120 people, and it is a room before you actually enter the cells, and they were here for weeks, and every single individual has been seriously tortured, including children, including the youngest is 14 years old, I found, including women. We had 4 women in there. It is absolutely unimaginable. And some persons had, one of the torture methods is that you shoot from short distance into the legs of the persons who are suspected of armed robbery, and then you leave the people without any kind of medical treatment. The medical doctor that accompanied me said, if those 3 persons there are not immediately, their legs are not immediately amputated, they would die within days. It was done, that is the advantage, but nevertheless 2 of them died soon afterwards. Nepal, as I told you, systematic practice of torture. Right down is a major military camp in Nepalganj. Those are metal boxes where people were kept for a long time. It's the heat is unbearable in there. On top, this is long time we didn't know what kind of torture method it was, but we finally found out it was electroshocks. Also, electric shocks can have these kind of consequences, as I was told by my forensic expert. left down is Hanuman Doka, the main police station in Kathmandu, totally overcrowding, systematic torture, which was finally admitted by the police chiefs there. Indonesia, again, overcrowdedness. Left on top is a case. 3 times in Indonesia I entered a room where torture was ongoing. In police stations, this is Jakarta, there was the torturer and the victim. So I asked the torturer to leave the room so that we could interview the detainee. He was scared to death. He said, no, I'm not a detainee. I'm just a visitor. I'm visiting my friends here. But unfortunately, as you can see, he was handcuffed to the chair. So I said, it's a usual practice that you handcuff visitors. And then they had to agree. And again, it was very clear by the medical investigation that he was seriously tortured. But again, it presents a very difficult situation for me and also for the person concerned, because he did not voluntarily. Of course, we then asked him, can we interview you? But in such a situation, it was very difficult to say no. But of course, he was very, very scared that as soon as we leave, he would be beaten up again. And I have, of course, the full assurance of governments that there will be no reprisals. But how do you enforce that? If there is the ICRC in a country, Jordan, for instance, was a good example, I asked the ICRC, could you please visit all the prisons where I have been and speak to these particular detainees in order to make sure that there is a follow-up. Sometimes I do it myself. I come a second time if I really have the feeling that there might be reprisals. In Equatorial Guinea, I tried it, but they didn't let me in again. She said, you have been here already. I said, I have full access. No, but you have been here. And if you come in, we shoot you. That was the answer. And that meant for me, I knew that there have been reprisals, but there's nobody in Equatorial Guinea. There are no NGOs. ICRC left the country. So there's nobody who can actually do the follow-up. And that is creating really a dilemma. How do you deal with that? I want, of course, to have information. I always respect the principle of informed consent. I'm always introducing myself. I'm telling, you don't have to speak to me. You take a certain risk if you speak to me, although the interview is totally confidential. But the very fact that you talk to me is very difficult to hide from the prison authorities or the police authorities. And at the end, I ask them, whatever you told me, can I use that in the public report with your name, without your name, anonymously or not at all? So I do that, but nevertheless, there's always a certain risk that these persons are subjected to reprisals that you cannot exclude, and sometimes we are leaving these police stations with a very, very bad feeling. Jordan, Al Jafra prison was one of the worst I have seen in southeast Jordan, in the middle of the desert, where more or less everybody whom we saw there was heavily beaten. They call it a welcome party. When you arrive there, for a week or so, you are kept in a specific area where they are beaten up every day. You could see it on more or less everybody that they were beaten up. Thanks to the government, Al Jafra prison has been closed soon after my visit. I recommended the closure of the prison. The government says we anyway wanted to close it. It has nothing to do with your visit, but in any case, it's closed. I'm coming to the end. China. I think China was very difficult because it was very difficult. Inside, I couldn't take photos. I couldn't take an forensic expert with me. In Tibet, for instance, that is the Kushui prison. At that time, I knew that they were building the prison, but I talked and they just denied that it was already ready. So I went to another famous prison near, in Tibet, near Lhasa. And I was looking, because I had a whole list of persons whom I wanted to see. So I said, can I see this person? It took a very long time to look into the prison register, etc. And they said, no, this person is not anymore here. I said, why? Yeah, he was moved away in March last year, whatever. And gone on, and with the 10th person, I said, no, let's stop this. They were all moved on the same day. Where have they been moved to? No, we don't know. We don't know. So finally, then it turned out that this new prison was opened, and then I could go there. Of course, I had lost a lot of time and was only able to visit some of the most prominent prisoners. Left down Rebir Kader, also went to Xinjiang, Urumqi. That is where she was, and I looked into a particular place where actually she had been submitted to mental torture for 2 years in the most brutal way. So China was difficult also because there was such a level of fear that it was very difficult to find detainees to actually speak to me. It was even embarrassing for the prison officials. When we went from one cell to the other, I introduced myself. I said, who would be willing to speak to me? And everybody looked down and nobody said yes. And then finally I came to a cell where I saw an African person there, and I introduced myself in English, and before I ended he immediately said, yes, of course I want to talk to you. And he told me quite a lot about the prison conditions and the very, very strict discipline, not only in re-education through labor camps, also in pre-trial detention centers. They are really subjected to very, very strong re-education, despite that there's something that we call the presumption of innocence. Mongolia, yeah, I think I leave it with that. I think I'm over my time. There, of course, are many lessons, but I think that is something we can discuss because I think I have overstepped my time already. I just wanted to give you some kind of information about what it means to work as special rapporteur on torture. You see, you get to know countries from its worst side. But on the other hand, in my opinion, the way how society treat their detainees, and detainees are among the most vulnerable groups, I think is a very, very strong indicator for the human rights culture in a country. And let me end by a positive note. Denmark is not only the only country that I visited where I didn't find any case of torture, not one case, but also prison conditions that are by far better than in any other country that I have been. And they are based on the principle of normalization. You find that in the standard minimum rules of the treatment of prisoners of 1955. The principle of normalization means, in a prison, that you should treat prisoners in a way that life in prison resembles as much as possible life outside prison. That means education facilities, work facilities, recreation facilities aimed at the rehabilitation. Article 10 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights tells us clearly that the aim of a prison system is to rehabilitate the prisoner and prepare them for a life after prison, to re-socialize them. And of course they have a much lower rate of recidivism. Unfortunately, in many countries of the world, the purpose of prisons is locking people away. It's a punitive system that you find in most countries of the world. There's no real possibility to work, recreation, education, and of course the rate of recidivism and the violence in prison is very, very high. Thank you very much.